we're going to start in New Orleans with Zion Williamson as my number one. So I thought about doing David Griffin here because I think the real dynamic going on with the Pelicans actually includes much more than Zion. I actually don't think he's the most likely player to get traded with all the rumors that are flying around about their pursuit of the number 2 overall pick. But I just think the Zion of anybody who's like not impacting the on-court product of the NBA, I think Zion is probably like the single most interesting character in the league. I have this stat to just put into perspective where we are because again, they are rumored to be pursuing Scoot Henderson. Both Ingram and Zion potentially on the table in some of those negotiations. We can talk about which is more likely. But the stat that I have, Zion has played about 3,650 total minutes in his NBA career. That's 200 minutes fewer than Bam Adebayo played this season between the regular season and the playoffs. So Bam just got done with a run that accumulated almost as many minutes as Zion played in his entire rookie contract total. And so that just makes it impossible to know where to go with this guy. But I think when he's healthy, he's one of the most overpowering, exciting talents the league has ever seen. So it's just a really interesting point. And with the Pelicans' tax and financial situation kind of catching up with them, I think this is kind of the moment where they start to make decisions that are going to impact what this team looks like down the road after building a really good young core.
David Griffin was also almost on my list. I had a very distinct feeling you were going to put Zion on this list, so I didn't put him on mine for the sake of...
Was it the poster that you see every time we record of him that made you think maybe I had some interest? Yeah.
And just us talking about him. And look, he is literally and figuratively like a large presence over this. His name has been linked to trade scenarios. Friend of the program, Rafael Barlow, said Houston has talked about him. There's talk about this whole thing with Zion, and just also how little he's played, despite being this really tantalizing prospect and all the things he can do. It's like this really. I don't know if there is not an exact match for what we're looking at here with him. I think what makes it harder to talk about here, right? I think that the fact that we don't. If you're another team, Brendon, I was thinking about this when thinking about the Pelicans. I don't know how you look at Zion and from a what you're going to get out of him standpoint, give a proper evaluation. It would almost make me lowball David Griffin. Mm-hmm. But obviously if you're him, you say, well, it seems like they want Scoot. There's a lot of Pelicans want Scoot buzz. Is you need to get a certain pick for that, probably 3 or 2, depending on how that shakes out. This is just a very complicated thing, and it all stems back to me, if he wasn't this hurt, this wouldn't be a question. He would just be the best player in the Pelicans, and we'd be celebrating him now. But we aren't, and that's right with him.
Do you think he would be an All-NBA player if he didn't have health issues? I think he would almost have to be.
Depending on where his defense was at, yes, but his offensive stuff would be so overwhelming that it's not hard to imagine him as an All-NBA guy if he'd actually played 65 games last season.
I actually think the defense is kind of tied to the health in a way. I feel like what we saw at Duke was a pretty good defender when he was engaged and in a system that suited him. They played zone a lot and stuff, but I think that part of what's holding him back from playing defense, if you just watch them, and I was watching some highlights from a couple of their games early in the year when they were really good to start this past season, and he just doesn't athletically commit to playing defense. And I think if he was healthy, even that would get better. So I thought about the same thing from a trade package standpoint, and the best way that I could kind of come up with it, and this is just recent because I think trade stuff in the NBA has just gotten blown out to another level. It's kind of even hard to compare the past few years to any other point in NBA history. So the one that I could come up with that was recent was Ben Simmons. And not the Harden trade.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't mean that from a standpoint of his play. I think I mean it from the standpoint of the uncertainty around what you're getting.
Yeah.
I mean, if you think back to when Ben Simmons was on the market, he was claiming both mental health and back in a severe way for both. And I don't think anybody bidding for him knew what exactly the situation was going to be like. And I actually don't think the Harden deal is very comparable because that ended up being more like the Sixers were trading for Harden rather than the other way around. But the Sacramento trade that was on the table for a long time is the one that I was thinking of, which, if you remember, was Halliburton, Hield, Barnes, and 2 firsts. That feels similar to what the Pelicans might end up getting for Zion, although obviously it being the number 2 overall pick, if they were to go that route, probably, adds a little more value than what Sacramento was going to be able to give you. So maybe it's, that takes the place of sort of the Halliburton slot or however you want to do it. I just wonder how far you can really afford to go there. Considering with Simmons, even, it was a little hypothetical, whereas with Zion, it's just staring us in the face that there is a real chance that this dude is Greg Oden or something, and his body is just preventing him from ever staying healthy. And he hasn't even started his max extension. He agreed to it last summer, and it hasn't even started. So you're trading for a guy with hundreds of millions of dollars guaranteed that you might never get the value back for.
Well, and it's on that note, this is someone where I could see another team being like, yeah, that's an asset to us as well because we get a chance to have him, on a contract and have him under team control. And then you could also look at it and say, that's really risky for us. Like, can we afford to do that for a guy who played 29 games last year, missed the entire year before? Like, and when it feels like he's taken steps forward, he then has taken steps back. Like, I just don't know. There's certain teams that I think could do it and should do it, and it's worth the risk.
I mean, but we're really only talking about Portland and Charlotte, right? Because if the Pelicans' interest is to get Scoot, then kind of has to be one of those. Do you think either one of them should do it?
Charlotte should.
Okay.
I would do it if I'm Charlotte. I think if I'm Charlotte and you tell me I get to roll the dice on Zion with where I'm at, I think Zion's ceiling is just better than Brandon Miller or Scoot Henderson. You pair him with LaMelo, yes, you have some real financial risk in both those guys and basically kind of committing to them as your duo without having them seeing play the game because Melo is going to be contract extension eligible soon and is going to ask for the max, I'm sure. But I think Zion's ceiling is A, as to be better than LaMelo, and B, like, it would just be it would be a better ceiling for your team, I think, than Brandon Miller or Scoot. There's a lot of risk involved that could go very badly for you, but I think if I'm them, I would do it. I think Portland, the answer is probably no. Just because
that can't be what you do to satisfy Dame. Hey, here's this guy you might never play with.
Yeah, Portland, if they're going to do a trade like that, needs some certainty as much as you can get certainty. That is not
certainty.
Zion is the opposite of certainty for any team that is looking to trade for him.
So 2 interesting things here, and we can maybe talk about Ingram a little bit here too. Zion is a Jordan Brand athlete. Take or leave that. We don't even know how much longer Michael Jordan will be the managing partner of the Charlotte Hornets, but for now he is. Maybe that matters. Maybe more importantly, Brandon Ingram is a North Carolina guy, born in North Carolina, and was drafted by the current general manager of the Charlotte Hornets, Mitch Kupchak. And so I think that question is a little more interesting to me because this move is about resetting the team's clock more than anything else. And I don't know if that's getting talked about enough, but Shamit Dua has been doing a lot of good stuff in his In the Know newsletter that I read through today. And the really plugged in New Orleans people understand that this is much more about the fact that Ingram, Zion, and CJ make a ton of money and that Herb Jones and Trey Murphy are going to be pretty expensive players in their own right, probably not max guys, but maybe Murphy could become that depending on how he plays this season. And that this is about what is our future going to be and what can we reasonably afford to pay our best players if they're not going to be available, and who should our best players be if they're not going to be, if the current ones aren't going to be available. And Ingram follows into that as well. He just has not been healthy, even though he's obviously out there more than Zion. Would you trade the number 2 pick for Ingram if you're Charlotte? Is that a deal worth doing?
I think so, because I also think his ceiling, we know what it is, and I think he's gotten better and better and better. And I think you could feel pretty certain about him. I would probably do that if I'm Portland. If we wanted to say, like, Portland wanted to do it, I would do it for the third pick, too, if we wanted to lump them in there as well.
I think that Ingram is a really good player. I like him probably more in Portland. I don't even really know why, but I guess...
Well, it's because you know what they are. Yeah. But, like, it's just you know what Portland is. If it's like, then it's Dame. It's a core of Dame and probably re-sign Jeremy Grant and Brendon Ingram. You know what that is. If anything goes to the Hornets, I don't know what that is. That team and franchise doesn't have a real identity at this current moment.
They have, like, Terry Rozier and Cody Martin are the only two players under contract the season after this one. So, yeah, I don't know what the Hornets are. Okay, so we're both in agreement that Ingram seems maybe more likely to go, and that both of those teams should probably still do that deal. It sounds like we're headed toward a change for New Orleans then.
Which I think is okay. I think that is okay for them. I think it makes sense for them to try to do something a little bit different right now. And I am sure kind of knowing David Griffin a little bit and covering him in Cleveland and just kind of understanding his philosophy, I would not be surprised if he's looking for some kind of cultural figuring it out there a little bit. That would not surprise me.
I have one last thing on Zion. If we're assuming that he stays in New Orleans, I thought this was interesting. So a lot of the other stuff going on behind the scenes is related to the training staff. And there was a really good article by Christian Clark at the Times-Picayune in New Orleans like 2 weeks ago about the Pelicans firing Aaron Nelson, which he's the guy who in Phoenix got a ton of attention for helping with Michael Redd and Shaq and a lot of these like reclamation projects in the mid-2000s during some of those 7 seconds or less years, and just kind of getting guys right physically in a way that they hadn't been able to be. They hired him when Griffin got there based on their connection from Phoenix, and then it apparently went awfully. But there was a quote in here from Stan Van Gundy from his time in New Orleans, which actually was Zion's most healthy season. And he said, quote, "When I got the job, I called Coach K at Duke." Van Gundy said, "I remember him saying to me about Zion that, quote, Stan, the best way to get Zion in shape and get him ready is he needs to play. He needs to scrimmage in practice. He needs to play in games. He needs to play." And that was a big part of what Stan's problem was in New Orleans, was it was the COVID year, like the worst of the worst COVID year, when none of those teams were practicing, because it was like, we're going to get each other sick, or the schedule's so awful that we're just going to be exhausted all the time. They couldn't practice, but he wanted to. But it also was the time when Zion was the healthiest. And that just was interesting to me. I'm not going to pretend to be a sports scientist or any sort of Zion doctor, but sometimes that's what it takes. And I do think Zion's getting into a situation where it's just like, how is he even supposed to get in shape? You can get mad at him all you want that he doesn't take it seriously, which is code for I don't know what I'm talking about when media people like to say that. But it's like, the best way to get in basketball shape is probably to play basketball. And he just hasn't been able to do that because of these injuries. But it's just a weird kind of situation that he finds himself in where he can't stay healthy for long enough to be healthy.